Hi, my name is Jim McNeil. I'm going to be demonstrating some techniques that you can use to create tessellations. So what is a tessellation? A tessellation is a potentially endlessly repeating pattern made up of one or more interlocking shapes. They fit together like puzzle pieces with no gaps or no overlaps. Tessellation designs have been used for thousands of years by artists all over the world. Here are some examples of Islamic designs. They were used to decorate the floors and ceilings of palaces and mosques. They were often made using mosaic tile. The tessellated designs in the Alhambra Mosque in Spain inspired the Dutch graphic artist M.C. Escher to make his own tessellated designs. The contribution that Escher made to tessellations was to make them out of recognizable figures, which is what inspired me to do my own tessellations. This is the first one I ever did. It's called corporate downsizing. This is the second tessellation that I created. It's called Escher Fu. It's a group of kung fu fighters. This was the third tessellation I created, called Escher Bowl, of football players. This last one is a very complicated looking one of punk rockers in what's called a mosh pit. There are three different ways to create tessellations. The first one that I'm going to demonstrate is called translation. This is an example of translation. As you can see, this woman's face and this woman's face are the same shape. You create a translation by sliding shapes next to each other in both a horizontal and vertical direction. We're going to be making these out of cut paper. The materials that I'll be using are a 3-inch by 3-inch square of light cardboard. I use a 3 by 5 index card and cut it down to a square. A pencil, a roll of tape, an eraser, a pair of scissors, some glue, and some markers, and 2 pieces of different colored paper. The first step is to create the template that you'll use to create your tessellation. First thing that we'll do is draw a wavy line from the top left corner to the top right corner. When you're first starting out, you don't have to do anything too complicated. In order to understand the way tessellations work, it'd probably be smart to keep it simple. The second step is to draw another line from the top left corner to the bottom left corner. Again, keep it simple. Now, we'll take our scissors and cut along the lines we just drew. You should end up with 3 pieces. When creating a translation, the top piece gets slid down to the bottom edge of the square and then taped down. The left side gets slid to the right side and then taped down. This is an example of a template that I'll use to trace the repeated pattern onto a large piece of paper. I used the same technique to create the template for the woman's face. I once again started out with 3 pieces. The top piece gets slid to the bottom edge and taped down. The left edge gets slid to the right edge and taped down. I've drawn a grid of squares the same size as the cardboard square that we started out with. You'll want to draw these very lightly because they're going to be used as guides to line up your template. You line up the original corners of your square template with the corners on the guides, and then trace around the template using your pencil. To move to another square, you slide it the same way you slid to make the template. Slide it to the next square, and trace around the sides again. You slide in both directions, both left and right and up and down. As I continue to trace, I won't have to trace around the entire template because some of those lines will be there from previous tracings. I've completed tracing the template in all of the squares. I then go on to a piece of darker paper and repeat the exact same process. The only difference being that after I finish it, I cut out all the pieces. So I end up with shapes like this. After you've cut them up, you're going to end up with smaller pieces like this. Don't throw them away because you're going to be using them. The next step is to glue down the cutouts in a checkerboard pattern. We're going to start out in the upper left corner and paste a cutout on every other square. Once I've pasted down all the cutouts, I then erase the guidelines. You want to wait for the glue to dry and get stable before you do any erasing. We now have a pretty nice abstract pattern, but what I'm now going to do is add surface details to each shape to make it look like a woman's face. I'm going to use a marker, but you can really use any medium you'd like. You can make every single shape different inside the shape. This is the finished piece that demonstrates translation. The figures slide next to each other and up and down. They divide the two-dimensional plane evenly. The underlying abstract pattern created by the shapes, I turned into a recognizable face using the marker. So let's review the steps of creating a translation. I started out with a cardboard square, drew a line between the top left and the top right corners, drew another line between the top left and the bottom left corner, and then cut along those lines. I then slid the top cut piece to the bottom edge and slid the left cut piece to the right edge and taped them together. Then I traced them onto a grid. I traced them onto a second piece of paper, cut out those shapes, and pasted them onto the first piece of paper. And then I filled in details with a marker. The second tessellation that I'll be demonstrating is called rotation. This is an example of a rotation. Now, where in translation the figures were sliding next to each other, left to right and up and down, the figures in a rotation turn around an axis. I'll start the rotation template by using a 3x3 square of cardboard. Now, the first step is going to be to draw a line from the top left corner to the top right corner. We'll then draw a line from the top left corner to the bottom left corner. I'll now cut the square along the lines that I drew. I used the index card because of the blue lines ruled on the front. They can be good guides for making sure that you're creating the right kind of tessellation. So now I've once again ended up with 3 pieces. When I created the translation template, I took the top piece and slid it down to the bottom and joined it there. With a rotation tessellation, I'm going to take the top piece and swing it like a door on a hinge, counterclockwise to the right edge, and join it there instead. When I was creating the translation template, I slid the left piece over to the right edge, but that's now occupied by the top. What I do now is take the left edge and swing it like a door on a hinge, clockwise to the bottom, and join it there. This was the reason why I like to use the blue lines on the index card, because if you've created the rotation template correctly, the lines on the cutout pieces should be running in the opposite direction from the lines on the piece from which you cut them. As I did with the translation, I drew a grid onto the paper, and we'll now take our template, line it up with the original corners of the cardboard square, and trace around it. The way it differs from translation is going to be in the way we move it to the next square. With the translation, we slid it to the next square, but as you can see, the shapes would overlap. So what we do is swing the shape the same way that we swung the cutout pieces onto the template. Line up your corners again and trace around it. Swing it around again. Line up the corners and trace around. To summarize the way I rotated the shape, I started in the upper right corner and rotated in a counterclockwise direction up into the next square. To rotate into the square below it, I started at the lower right corner, rotated once again in a counterclockwise direction down into the next square. To get to the left, I start the bottom left corner and rotate once again in a counterclockwise direction into the next square. I took that group of 4 shapes and repeated them throughout the entire page. I repeated the tracing process on a different color paper, cut those shapes out, and will now glue them on to the first piece of paper, once again using a checkerboard pattern. I pasted the blue shapes down, waited for the glue to dry, and now I'll erase the guidelines. Now I'll add interior details with a marker. So this is the completed rotation tessellation. Birds in flight. The third tessellation I'll be showing you is called reflection. This is an example of a reflection. Unlike translation, where the figures were sliding next to each other, both across and up and down, in a reflection, they flip in both directions. I'm going to be starting the reflection tessellation template a little differently than I did the other two. We're going to start at the bottom rather than at the top this time. I'm going to start drawing another line from the bottom right corner to the bottom left corner. Now, all of these tessellations are coming from studies I've already made. So it may look like I know what I'm doing a lot more than I really do. It can take a lot of trial and error to make a good tessellation that looks like a recognizable figure. When you first start out, I would recommend keeping it very simple and very abstract. Go for a nice-looking design rather than a recognizable figure, and work your way up. I'm then going to cut along these lines. And just as I did with the translation and rotation tessellations, I end up with 3 different pieces. The difference between the methods of tessellation is the way you move the pieces and join them. With translation, we slid the pieces to the opposite side. With rotation, we rotated them around one of the corners. With reflection, we have to flip the piece over first and then slide it to the opposite side and join it with a piece of tape. Now, once again, you can see the benefit of working with index cards, because when I flipped the piece over, the blue lines were no longer there. Same thing for the bottom piece. Flip it over first, and then slide it to the opposite side. and join it. Starting out with a grid, I'll take the template, and line up the corners of the original square, the squares of the grid, and trace around it. In order to move to the next square, we have to move the shape the same way that we moved the cutout pieces. You have to flip the template and then move it. Once again, has to be flipped and moved. Now to move into the next square vertically, you have to flip and move. I continued to flip, move, and trace the shape in every square on the paper. I then took another piece of different colored paper and repeated the process. Cut those pieces out. After pasting the shapes down, waiting for the glue to dry, and erasing the guidelines, I could then go into each shape and add interior details with a marker. Started out as an abstract design, became an elephant. This is the finished piece that demonstrates reflection tessellation. As you can see, the elephant flips diagonally to form a mirror image of himself in both directions for the two different colors. All three tessellations start out the same way. They all start out with three separate pieces. The differences lie in the way those pieces are moved and rejoined. Now remember, keep it simple when you're starting out. Just start out with simple, abstract patterns, and then work your way up to recognizable figures. If you keep at it, I think you'll really surprise yourself with the results. Here are some results of the student tessellations.